I was doing my Sunday night drives for extra money with DoorDash and Uber Eats. My friends show me how to use both at the same time and make more money per hour. One of the biggest issues with doing delivery services is that you have a lot of downtime where you just drive around waiting for an order to pop up. But if you work both apps at the same time, you can get rid of all that downtime and constantly be making money. So I was doing this for a few hours, racing back and forth between houses and restaurants, when I got a small order from a nearby restaurant, but the house was far away. These are the worst kinds of orders because you drive far and get paid less, though this one offered a large amount, meaning the tip must be crazy big. Accepting it, I picked up the order and began the 25-minute drive to their address. Halfway through the drive, while on a side road, I got a call from the app, assumingly being the customer. I answered, asking if this was my Uber Eats customer. A man confirmed he was my customer and apologized profusely, saying he ordered from his friend's account and forgot to change the address. He said his house was just around the block though, and he proceeded to give me directions, telling me a couple turns to take once I reached the friend's house. I asked him for the address just in case I got lost, but he responded saying I'll see him outside waiting for him, then hung up. Obviously, this shit was not normal. However, I was more than halfway there at this point, and I gave the man the benefit of the doubt, as forgetting to switch it from your friend's address seemed like a legit thing that could happen. It could have also been the fact that I was a bigger guy that helped me convince myself to go through with the delivery, as I wasn't really afraid of anything. When I got to the supposed friend's house, I took the turns as the man had said and drove down a dimly lit neighborhood road until I reached a no outlet sign and saw the road ended just a few houses down. Feeling confident I had taken the turns as the man had said, I pulled over and grabbed my phone to call the customer. Just as I was clicking into my recent calls, a knock at my driver window made me jump. A bit embarrassed at how noticeably startled I was, I rolled the window down to greet him, but looking up at the man, his face had no emotion, just a completely straight, blank face. I let go of the window button and immediately pressed the lock button, which was followed by the man sticking a gun through the half-open window right at my head as he yelled out something. I heard more voices call back, followed by a group of people running up to the car and trying to open the door handles. They were all yelling commands at each other, but in the heat of the moment, I couldn't make out what they were saying. I was in a full-on shock, staring into the barrel of this guy's gun. If I had to guess, there were at least 5 or 6 people surrounding my car. In this moment, I don't even remember having any thoughts, but I can only describe it as more of a reflex type reaction, because when the man holding the gun looked away for a split second, I suddenly slammed on the gas, flooring it down the street. I'm surprised the man even held on to his gun as he pulled his hand out of the window just in time. Seeing the end of the road though, I quickly did a 3-point turn, and when I faced the other end of the street again, they were all gone. Not a single one of them anywhere on the road, sidewalk, or by the houses. They must have just fled the scene the instant I began driving. As soon as I made it out of the neighborhood, I called 911. These gang-type attacks are relatively common around here, but I never thought it would happen to me. Although nothing came of it, with nobody being found and every piece of evidence leading to nowhere, I see this event as a sort of wake-up call for me. I realized in the moment that the man put a gun to my head that being a big, confident man meant absolutely nothing. Taking a risk like that was purely stupid, because literally anyone with a weapon can have your life in their hands in an instant. If you work a job like this, or do anything where you see strangers regularly, be careful, because putting yourself in a risky situation with a stranger could be the last thing you ever do. During COVID, delivering groceries became pretty popular, and even after, people still had them delivered to their house. I was a picker for those orders, and when we were understaffed, which was pretty much all the time, I was also dropping them off. It wasn't a bad job. I actually enjoyed driving to people's homes. I got to see nice houses, and I didn't have to deal with the constant questions from customers, so I wasn't complaining. I got tips sometimes too, which was nice. Most of the time though, I left the groceries at the doorstep, took a picture as proof, and then left. But I did have moments where I got to meet the people and help them take in the groceries. One instance was this older lady from Serbia. Her name was Vesna, and she loved me. We got to know each other, cause every Thursday she'd have pretty much the same stuff ordered to her house at the exact same time. The first few times I dropped off her groceries, she never came outside, but I'd catch her peeking out the window at me. I'd give a little wave, take my picture, then get back in the truck and leave. I think once she realized it was the same person delivering her groceries every time, she got more comfortable. She came out and greeted me. Then slowly over time I started bringing in the groceries for her and setting them on her counters. She was pretty old, so I was happy to help, and she also tipped nicely too. The more I went, the more I got to know her. She was recently widowed and lived alone. All her children lived far away, and she only saw them once or twice a year for the holidays when she could take the train. She was also retired, but she used to be a broker, which explained her nice house. I always looked forward to Thursdays, and this one was no different. She had ordered everything on Monday, as she always did, and I was dropping off the following Thursday. When I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed that something was off. She wasn't at the door like she usually was, but the door was open. I also noticed that all her blinds were closed, which was strange. She always kept them open so her plants could get some sun. I went up to the open front door, and not seeing her, I rang the doorbell. I waited for a bit, but there was no answer. I knocked a few times, and there was no answer again, so I naturally started to become a little worried. She was old, so my immediate thought was maybe she fell or had a heart attack or something. I kinda stood there wondering what I should do. I thought maybe I should go inside, but I was also on the job, and I know the rules are that if no one answers, I just have to leave the groceries on the porch. Being her friend though, I decided it best to go inside and at least put her groceries on the counter like usual. The door was open after all. I grabbed all the bags in both of my hands and walked straight into the kitchen. All the lights were off and everything was quiet. Placing the bags on her counter, I called out her name, again hearing no response. As I started walking out, calling the police crossed my mind, but I didn't really know how to explain this was an emergency, because what if she was just out of the house? Maybe she was just visiting someone, and I just wasted the police officer's time. I really was in a weird position, but I just knew something was wrong. But just as I got to the doorway leading outside, I heard movement in the house upstairs. I felt relieved for a moment, calling out for Vesna, but then there was again no response. No one came to the door or answered me. After a minute of standing there, I kept hearing shuffling movement as if someone was moving stuff around upstairs, and started to feel really awkward and uncomfortable. I headed back outside and got in the car. I sat there for a little while, and after a minute, I saw the curtains on the second story move to the side as if someone was looking at me through the window. I pulled out and drove around the corner, then parked on the street and sat there, just really confused. I didn't know if it was her and she just didn't want to see anyone, or maybe one of her kids. I was also concerned with whether or not I should call the police. I drove off, went around the block, and then decided to drive by her house again. I sat there for a little while again, until I saw the upstairs curtains open. I saw a male figure look out, and then closed it quickly as if seeing my truck scared him. I knew Vesna had 2 daughters, and she had a son, but he had passed away years ago, so I'm not sure who could possibly be at her house with her not there, and where would she be anyway? I had been there too long though, and had to get back to work. The following week, there were no orders from her for the first time in almost a year. I drove by her house after I got off on Thursday, and in the driveway was an officer's car. When I got home, I searched her name and found that she had been filed as missing only a few days after I had been there to deliver her groceries. I noticed the date they said she was likely last at home, though, was the day after she had ordered the groceries. 2 days before, I had gone to her house and saw that man. I went to the police with all the information I had. I don't know who that man was, or if I was close to having something happen to me as well. But it's been nearly 3 years now, and there have been no updates.
Back before smartphones and social media and all that other stuff, you had internet relay chat. These were primitive chat rooms where you just picked a username and boom, you could talk to all manner of complete strangers about innocent and not so innocent topics. If you've heard the term ASL before, that's where it came from, because you always opened by asking someone their age, sex, and location, and what you got in reply could wildly vary from user to user. One night, I see this username, Desert Roads F18. I figured it's probably a girl around my age in the southwest or southeast, and given that I was still living in Texas at the time, I figured that I'd just hit her up. I was right about her being in the south, as she was apparently just over the state line in New Mexico. So that gave us something to talk about at first, but then as the conversation meandered on, things started getting more and more personal. She told me her name was Rose, and that she needed someone to cheer her up. So I set about trying to do just that. I thought I'd done a pretty good job, and when she seemed sufficiently chipper again, I asked if she wanted to talk about whatever was making her blue. And that's when she tells me that she was sad because she had to drop out of college, but that she'd done so in order to take care of her mother, who was suffering from a very painful variety of terminal cancer. Honestly, that was just about the heaviest thing I'd heard at the time, and I thought her attitude to it was nothing short of incredible. Sure, it hurt to put her dreams on hold for a while, but it would be worth it to know that she'd been a dutiful daughter, as she phrased it. At one point, and I know this sounds crazy, but I asked if she needed me to send her any money. Honestly, it was just bait to see if the girl was some kind of scammer. I mean, I'm dumb, but I'm not that dumb. And when she said no, that she'd never take money off of someone as sweet as me, direct quote, I was convinced that she was legitimate. And not just legit either, but maybe the sweetest, maybe most pure-hearted girl I'd ever come across. We talked for hours and hours about every little thing, all our passions and interests and hopes for the future. I think it was around 9 p.m. when I first sent her a message, and we didn't stop talking until just after 4 in the morning. It was that kind of intense, and I had butterflies in my stomach the whole time, especially after she sent me a picture of herself. She was gorgeous, and when I playfully accused her of being a catfish, she sent me a picture of her holding up her palm with my username and a rough heart drawn on it. I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. She was the kind of girl I'd be way too nervous to approach in real life, but as I mentioned, I had all that internet confidence on my side, and it seemed to have paid off massively. We kept on talking for like a whole 5 days afterwards, morning till night, getting more and more affectionate and romantic as the days went by. It got to the point where we discussed long-distance relationships, moving cities, if only for a short while. Like I said, it was that level of intense. I remember the pair of us being like, whoa, this is all going very quickly and we haven't even talked on the phone yet. So, to fix that, we agreed to a phone call the following evening. The plan was, I'd hit her up around the time we agreed, get her phone number, then we'd talk on the phone for a little while. I was very excited. In fact, I looked forward to it all day. All the crap I had to put up with at work, and it was an unusually high amount that day. And it was all just like water off the duck's back. None of it bothered me because after I clocked out, I'd get to go home and talk to Rose. The thing is, things didn't quite work out like that. I got home, got online, logged into IRC chat, but Rose's username was nowhere to be seen. No big deal, I thought. I'll just make some dinner and wait for her to come online. So, that's what I do. I make some food, take a shower, walk to the corner store to pick up some beers, but even once I'd gotten all that out of the way, there was still no sign of Rose. Around maybe 8 or 9 in the evening, I started to think that I was being stood up, and it's kind of embarrassing to remember how upset and anxious I'd actually got. But eventually my patience paid off, and the click of that chat notification sound had me running to my PC to find that Rose had sent me a message. She apologized for being late, saying it was typical that she'd get held up picking up medications on the one evening that she had something planned. I tell her it's no problem, and then she gives me a phone number to call. It was a 575 number, and I knew that was the area code for a bunch of New Mexico phone numbers, so it all matched up with the story that she'd given me thus far. But then, she tells me that when I call, I'm to ask for Annie and not Rose. When I asked why that was, she told me that her full name was Roseanne, and that she'd always gone by Annie, a name she now loathed in favor of Rose. I did think that was kind of unusual, but it didn't put me off calling her in the slightest. She also told me that her uncle might answer the phone, so not to be alarmed or intimidated by some moody-sounding older man if he happened to pick up the call. I take this all in my stride, totally unquestioning, and when I was ready, I called the number. And just like Rose had said, a man with a very unfriendly tone answered the call. So, just as she told me to do so, I asked the guy if I could speak to Annie. And there was a long silence, and then the man asked, "Who is this?" I was honest with him. I told him I was friends with Annie and that she'd asked me to call her. Again, there was a long silence, then literally said the words, "If this is supposed to be a joke, sure as hell isn't a funny one." And then it was my turn to be silent for a few seconds as I tried to work out exactly what I'd done wrong. It definitely wasn't the wrong number. I'd been ultra careful in dialing the numbers, so it couldn't have been all that. And all I could think to do was just ask again, being polite as possible while apologizing for the confusion. The man seemed to relent a little, then explained that the confusion was entirely on my part. Annie couldn't have told me to call her that night because Annie was dead. The man then excused himself, sounding like he was choking back emotion as he did so, then he hung up. I'm not gonna lie, I was extremely freaked out at first. I didn't exactly think that I'd been talking to a ghost on IRC or anything dumb like that, but I was most definitely in a state of shock and confusion. I typed to Rose, "Are you sure you gave me the right number?" And after some time, she replied that she had indeed given me the wrong number, and apologized if it had caused any trouble. Me, like a total idiot, takes her apology at face value, even though there's this burning sensation in my head telling me that something is very wrong. I call the second number that she gives me, which again has a New Mexico area code, and as it rings, I realize I'm actually sweating from how nervous I am. I'm also literally praying that Rose isn't just ghosting me, and the longer the call rang for, the more and more beside myself I became. In the end, the call went to an answering machine, and the answering machine apparently belonged to the University of New Mexico's Adult Psychiatric Center. Things still didn't make sense, but they started to make a little more sense, if you get what I'm saying. If some kind of mental health issue was at play, I honestly thought that I could have looked past it. I really did like this girl that much, or at least I liked the idea of that girl enough to look past it. But again, things didn't quite go as I planned them. When I asked Rose if she lived in the UNM's psych center, she simply replied, "Lol." I thought this was her way of breaking the truth to me, so I launched into some line-by-line speech of how I didn't care and I was willing to look past it. And this was before the whole typing feature that modern direct messages apps employ, so I had no idea that Rose had been typing some big all-caps reply, probably from the moment I told her, "It's okay, I understand." I don't remember what it said word for word, but it was pretty nasty. In the most humiliating way possible, Rose told me that, well, there was no Rose, and that idiots like me were so stupid and lonely that we believe anything we're told. It went on and on like that, the most brutally insulting and demeaning things you can possibly dream up, and in the end, I just found myself asking, why? And do you know what this person said in reply? Because it's fun. I guess this sounds kind of pathetic, but it hurt. It really hurt me. And I realized that there were people out there who got off on building up people's hopes, only to dash them when they least expected it. I'd rather they were a financial scammer because at least they'd actually get something out of it. But going to all that trouble and effort of convincing me that Rose was real and being satisfied with just knowing I was hurting. The existence of people like that is something that still downright terrifies me. A couple of years ago, when I was in between jobs, I moved into an apartment to save money. The apartment complex was beautiful. It was a smaller complex located right in the heart of a quiet and nestled community. Most of the residents in the complex were older folks that were retired and just didn't need the space of an entire house. When I was moving into the building, I noticed another young person like me watching from one of the windows. It was a beautiful girl, someone that personally I would consider to be out of my league. Unfortunately, my career didn't allow for much dating. After moving in, I noticed that often I would come or go from the parking lot and I would see the woman looking at me. I just assumed that she was nosy or something like that, and I didn't think for 1 second that she had any interest in me. Down the road from the complex was a grocery store that was very convenient to stop in on my way home from work. One afternoon after work, when I stopped in the store to grab some dinner, I ended up physically running into the girl who had been staring at me for a few days now, and I literally mean that we physically collided with each other. I was turning into an aisle with my head on my phone, and she was walking out of the aisle. In a nervous voice, she said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm just an idiot sometimes." I started to say it was okay, but stopped when I realized who it was. Once everything clicked, I said, "Hey, are you the girl that lives in my building?" She started to smile and blush and then said, "Yeah, that's me." I'm usually the one who gets nervous and blushes uncontrollably in these kinds of situations, so it was nice that the heat was on someone else for a change. She made some comments about her stupid cheeks turning red, and I responded by telling her that in high school, my friends used to call me a cherry pie because my face was always red. We both laughed as I diffused the tension. We made small talk for a little while right there in the store, and then that evolved into a real conversation. Finally, I worked up the courage to ask if she wanted to come over for dinner tonight since we were practically neighbors. She smiled and looked thrilled by the offer. She accepted and said that she would be over at around 7, and we exchanged numbers and went about our shopping. I was so excited and nervous about my date with this very attractive neighbor that I had. I realized that I only had about an hour to clean my apartment and get ready. I hadn't had a real date since my freshman year of college, over 4 years ago, so I was admittedly a train wreck in my mind. I even remember while I was cleaning the apartment, I got a text from her that said, "I can't wait for tonight," with a heart. Before I knew it, it was 7, and she was knocking on my door. The first several hours were amazing. We talked, ate dinner, had some wine, and just had a great evening. I felt like this was my first real adult date, and I was proud of how it was unfolding. Late in the evening, I was ready for bed, and this was a weeknight, and I had to work the next day, and I could tell that she wanted to stay, but I made it clear that I wasn't ready for anything further than this. She was understanding, and we said goodnight at around 11 p.m. When I walked her to her door, which sat about 30 feet from my door, I kissed her goodnight, and she smiled. I walked inside my apartment with an overwhelming feeling of joy and happiness. I woke up at around 3 a.m. that morning just to use the bathroom, and I noticed something weird as I walked into the hall. In the light that was shining under the door to my apartment was a shadow, like someone was standing in front of my door. I figured it was my tired eyes just playing tricks on me, so I didn't worry too much. After the bathroom, when I walked by the door again, I noticed that the obstruction to the light was still there. I quietly went over to the door and looked through the peephole in the door, and standing right outside my door was the girl that I had just shared an entire evening with. She looked like she was mumbling something under her breath, but I wasn't sure. If I ever look through one of those holes, they're not very clear sometimes, so I watched for a few seconds and she didn't move at all. I snuck back into my room and grabbed my phone. I made sure that it was silent and went back to the door, and I texted her phone and said, "Hey, I can't sleep, but I just wanted to let you know that I had a great time tonight." Seconds later, she grabbed her phone from her pocket, and with no expression on her face, she responded with, "Me too," with an exclamation point. "I can't wait to see you again." I waited for a moment, and then sent another text that said, I'm surprised you're awake. What are you up to? Her response turned the butterflies in my stomach to stone when she responded with, "Oh, just laying in bed, watching Netflix." I couldn't understand why she was standing there and lying about it. I didn't respond to her text right away. I had no idea what to say to this woman or how to approach a situation like this. While I was thinking of something to say, she texted me again, this time saying, "If you want, I can come back, or you can come here." The text was followed by a bunch of emojis. I started to type a response but kept deleting whatever I typed. While I was typing, she texted me again and said, "You have nothing to be afraid of." And that text hit me differently for some reason. I finally sent a simple text that just read, "Thanks for the offer, but I'm really tired." I looked through the hole as she read the message, and still, with no expression on her face, she put the phone back in her pocket and looked right at the peephole. I knew she couldn't see me, but the horror that I felt when I sort of made eye contact with the woman through the door was almost indescribable. The look on her face was not the same look I had just admired that evening prior. Her eyes looked cold, and I have no idea what her intentions were, but I just felt like they weren't good. I know I'm not good at dating, but I do know standing outside someone's door in the middle of the night motionless is not normal behavior. I decided to text her one last time and said, "Hey, did you hear anything funny in the hall? I thought I heard a knock on my door." This was my poor attempt to try and fish something out of her, or at least elicit some reaction. She looked at the text for a minute, then back at the peephole with her cold eyes as if though she knew I was there. And without moving from her position, she texted me one last time that said, "You're a smart boy. Very smart. Sleep tight." She put her head back down, and after about 5 minutes of just standing there, she turned around and went back to her apartment. She looked like she had something tucked in the back of her pants, but looking through the peephole, this could have just been my imagination, so I wasn't sure. I texted her the next day and she never responded. Even though she lived a few doors down, I never did run into her again. I left a note for her one time and slipped it under her door and still never heard from her. I never told the apartment management because I didn't really think anything could be done. It was an unnerving and terrifying experience for me, but I had no proof other than a few text messages that didn't show anything legal or really make any sense. I never saw her again, which is insane considering that I lived at this apartment for 6 months after this experience. The curtains were always shut when I would get home from work, and I never crossed paths with her in the hallway. Now I know the story isn't your typical, "Oh God, I'm gonna die" story, but to put yourself in my shoes, I guarantee you wouldn't want to be me. The memory of that look in her eyes still haunts me to this day. Friends have always joked with me that she probably was just looking for some adult companionship, but I promise you this was different. Be careful out there because you never know what kind of intentions people have deep down.
This happened to me when I was in high school. Sarah, a friend of mine, had been inviting me over, yet I had declined every single one of the invitations. My parents were strict Christians who never let me sleep out for fear of me getting corrupted and ending up in a burning pit of hell for the rest of my afterlife. On that day, however, they were caught in a snow blizzard out of town and could not be home until the next day. Although I had been rejecting every one of Sarah's invitations, I truly wanted to sleep over at her place to experience what it would be like there. Once I got the call from my parents instructing me to lock the house up and not let anyone in until they were back, I rolled my eyes. I would definitely lock the house up, I thought, and smiled slyly. I phoned Sarah and informed her that I would be spending the night at her place. Her response was affirmative. I could not hide my excitement. It erupted from within me like a plugged volcano. I screamed into the mouthpiece while still on the phone with her. I rushed, grabbing a small backpack and stuffing a single clothing article inside, along with other items I would need over the course of one night. Then donning my raincoat, I walked the snowy path to Sarah's place after locking the house thoroughly. "Hey, Linda girl," came Sarah's silky voice when she opened the front door. "Hi," I managed to say, feeling a bit shy. "You were so loud over the phone. I loved you that way, baby girl. Don't let the cold in," she smirked. I shrugged in response to her statement, and we burst into laughter. We both had a good laugh over it, and she took my backpack from me inside. "Loosen up, okay? I'm the only one home, too. My folks are out of town, so I got the whole place to myself. I was about to call my boyfriend when you hit me up," she said. "Oh, go on then. Don't let me stop you," was my response. She shook her head slowly at first. I could virtually see the wheels turning in her head before she finally made up her mind and just said, "Okay," picked up her phone and dialed her boyfriend's number. While they were about their conversation, my eyes roamed about the living room. It was so perfect to place. The lighting, the posh upholstery, and wall projector inside the large television, popular in many homes, had a mesmerizing effect. The place was physically appealing, and I couldn't help but feel emotion welling up inside me as I thought of the things my family could not afford to have. I brushed those thoughts aside after a time, and I focused on the reason I was there, to enjoy myself. "So girl, what do I offer you?" she asked. "Whatever you will," I said dryly. She got 2 cold beers and uncorked them, handed one over to me, and took a huge gulp out of the other one. She looked so hot in her white shorts and crop top, and even if I wasn't into girls, I definitely admired her. Soon her boyfriend, Magnus, was at the door, and we were having a mini party with plenty of alcohol. I am alcohol intolerant, so I let them have most of the fun, while I later gulped down can after can of soda. I admired the way that she and her boyfriend got along. They were indeed the model couple. Soon enough, they were both drunk and were sprawled in awkward positions next to each other on the sofa. I was unable to sleep, but was experiencing sharp bursts of energy that made me restless, possibly due to the sugar rush from too much soda. I sat in the sitting room watching TV and sucking at an empty soda can. I was hungry, I thought. Quickly, I grabbed my phone and scrolling through the food category on the online store, I came to a large, juicy box of pizza. I decided to try those out and selected Italian cheese flavor. I was sure that Sarah and her boyfriend would need some food too after their alcohol-induced nap, so I ordered a large 10-inch. I waited for a while, but my order had not yet come in. Sarah and her boyfriend were still out cold, and I doubted I could wait for them to awaken before filling my stomach. I placed another order and waited for about an hour too. Still nothing. It was midnight already, and I sure as hell wouldn't be getting any sleep on an empty stomach when there was something that I could do about it. I decided to check out if I was using the correct delivery address. I was sure, as I remembered Sarah's delivery address and had typed in the correct one, but I wondered why my orders weren't coming in. I grabbed my winter coat and got out of the house. There really had been a blizzard while we were having fun inside. Every inch of the lawn and yard was covered in a sheet of white. The snow was everywhere, and I had to watch my steps to ensure that I didn't trip when I walked out to the front gate. On getting to the gate, I looked out ahead of me and saw a bike. The bike looked very familiar. It was a pizza delivery bike. I walked up to it and looked all around it. I could find nothing. There was no pizza package and there was no rider. Strange, I thought. I decided to walk a little ways forward, and what I found horrified me. The falling snow had created a false path. This path although seemingly leading to Sarah's place, abruptly ended in a dangerous drop, and I began hoping that the delivery men were not so unfortunate as to have become victims of that deception. My fears were realized when I got to the place I knew the drop existed and peered down. 2 men lay motionless and half buried in the massive snow beneath. They were not moving, their limbs bent at awkward angles, and beside them were 2 large frozen boxes of pizza. I immediately turned around and ran all the way to Sarah's house, doing a terrible job of holding myself together until I got inside and barged into the sitting room, banging on the door so hard that Sarah and her boyfriend were wide awake in a jiffy, both their eyes puffy and wide. What on earth, Linda?" Sarah asked, noting the tears streaming down my face as I looked at her. I sobbed and pointed outside. She and her groggy boyfriend quickly got on their winter coats. They then followed me to the place where the 2 pizza delivery men were lying unconscious. The looks of alarm on their faces mirrored mine, and Sarah almost got into a fit just as I had. Every trace of sleepiness gone from both their faces. Sarah showed us a safe route to the bottom of the ditch which we took that led us to the men below. We examined both men and found out that they were both alive but had major frostbite and needed serious medical attention. The body of one of the men was hidden partially by a huge object covered with snow, which turned out to be his own bike. This man looked to be in much worse condition than his colleague because it appeared he had broken his spine. We lifted him up first from beneath the bike and took him inside the house, then came back for his colleague. Sarah quickly called the ambulance while I prepared a hot bath for both men. The man whose bike had fallen on him appeared to have just minutes before he was gone, as his breathing was very shallow and near imperceptible. When the hot bath was ready, we mixed it up so it would be temperate, and using pieces of cloth, all 3 of us worked on the men's bodies. Eventually an ambulance arrived and declared the one whose spine was broken dead on the spot. The second one they took in and said that they were there to admit him to an ICU ward if he was to have any chance of survival. They said the police would be there soon to take down our statements. "Who ordered for a pizza? Magnus? Did you?" Sarah asked her boyfriend. "Nope," he replied. They both then looked at me, and I buried my face between my arms. Sarah came and held me in her arms, and Magnus put his hands over the both of us. We stayed that way for some time until I happened to glance at my house and saw the headlights of my parents' car just moving slowly and carefully into the snow-covered driveway. My parents were back. One look at my wristwatch told me that it was 5:36 a.m. They had brought my sleepover to an abrupt end. I waved Sarah and her boyfriend goodbye and sneaked into my house, getting inside just before my parents could come out of the car.
I took a couple pictures and posted them up on Craigslist. I had listed a power drill, driver, and matching tool set for $80. Considering they weren't that old and still fully functional, this was a really good deal. It didn't take long to get responses. In just an hour, I got 2 replies to my post. One of them emailed me asking if $50 would be okay, but I politely declined. The other reply stated that they were very interested and wanted to buy them that same night for the listed price. I agreed and said I was available at 5 if he wanted to swing by and pick them up. I never let anyone into my house when selling things. I'd always just bring the stuff out to my driveway and talk to them there. It was a well-trafficked neighborhood street, so I wasn't worried about anyone attempting something out in the open. As I usually did, I was going to stand out in the driveway with the items a bit before 5 and wait for them so that I could make the transaction as quick as possible. But just past 4:30, there was a knock at the door. I looked out, seeing a man standing there with his red car parked in the driveway. I opened the door a crack, asking who he was. The man said he was here to buy the tools that were on Craigslist and admitted to being early. I told him to hold on for a minute and to just wait in his car, as I wasn't expecting him yet. He hesitated, making the interaction more awkward than it should have been, but then he turned around. Once he walked away, I got all the tools together and met him at the top of the driveway. I had an outlet outside for him to test the tools with, and he seemed satisfied with them. "About 20, he said while holding the drill. "The deal was 80. I can do a little lower, but 20 is too low," I said nicely, though I was slightly annoyed because he had already agreed to pay $80 for them, and $20 was just a total ripoff. He put the drill down, and without even looking at me, he walked back to his car and drove away. I was confused and upset, feeling like I'd been played and just had wasted my time. I got the tools back inside and just went on with my night, trying not to let myself get too upset about it. Really, it was just a small inconvenience. At least, that's what I thought. A couple hours later, I walked by the front windows, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw that same red car. It was parked just down the road, 3 houses away from mine. I looked closely, trying to be sure that it was that same man, but nobody was inside it. It was an empty parked car, so I had no way of knowing for sure. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence and carried on. Another hour would go by. I was just going on with my night, making food and watching TV, but then someone knocked on my door. I was a little shaken, but chose to ignore it and hope that whoever it was would go away. Obviously, the man from earlier was my first thought. Only 30 seconds passed before they knocked again. "Hey, it's me. I decided I'll take the tools. I brought the money," he yelled from the other side of the door. I didn't believe him at all. It all came together in my mind that car that I'd seen an hour ago was his, meaning that he'd been stalking my house all night. I didn't respond and instead called the police, informing them of the man's name and the car he had. The man called out several more times, saying he wanted to buy the tools, but then it went silent for a minute. Another minute passed. I wasn't sure what to do. The police were already on their way and would be here any minute, so I felt safe enough to be able to check out the windows. I quietly walked over to the window that was beside the door, but then suddenly I heard something hit the side of the house with great force. The sound was followed by leaves rustling and footsteps running away. I looked out the window and saw the guy running with a limp down to his car. The police turned in at the perfect time though, stopping him halfway. It surprised me to hear that the man admitted to a lot. He said he planned on robbing me, but I wouldn't let him into the house, which complicated things for him. Additionally, he tried climbing the tree on the side of my house and jumping onto the roof, but he missed, hitting the side and falling on his leg. The thing is though, he was armed with a knife, and the roof he tried to jump on was just under my second-story window, which after checking, was unlocked. So, if he had made the jump, he actually would have gotten inside. He claimed it was just an attempted robbery, but claims are just that. I stopped using Craigslist, and even to this day, I lock every single window in my house, even the ones that I think are unreachable. I used Craigslist many years ago to find a room for rent. I was looking for a house to stay at and be able to split rent with a roommate or roommates. It took maybe a week to find a place that was suitable for me and several phone calls with the owner before I was ready to move in. The owner who was to be my roommate seemed like a really normal, nice guy who was similar in age as me. He told me all about the place and what to expect, and I also felt like we connected well. With everything seeming perfect, I was getting really excited. I didn't have much to move, so I packed it all up and stuffed it in the trunk of my car, and in just a few days, I drove out 30 minutes to my soon-to-be home. It was located outside of the main town and in more of a woodsy terrain. It had a long driveway leading far from the road. Pulling in though, it was not as I'd expected. It was a very old wooden home. I knew it was passed down from his parents, but this place looked to be at least 100 years old. The pictures of the inside that I'd seen on Craigslist looked to be fairly modern, so I assumed they had to have done some pretty big renovations. I left everything in my car as I went up to the door and knocked. Aaron, the owner, came and showed me around. While the outside was not so impressive, the inside was the opposite. Very well maintained, clean, and definitely had been renovated not long ago. I was really happy with everything and moved my things in that night. Several days went by with no issues. It didn't even feel like I'd found this place on Craigslist. It felt like I was just living with a friend. Aaron worked in town though, so he was gone most of the time, and I worked from home, so I got to have the whole house to myself. Well, not the whole house. There was one door that was always locked. It wasn't any of my business, and I knew that, so I never brought it up with Aaron. But it still got me wondering. It was almost definitely the basement door, but this was odd because he said the house was a one-story home, not mentioning anything about having a basement. Another couple days went by before something happened. Aaron brought home some fast food for dinner, and then went to bed early because he had work the next day. I stayed up a while longer, then did the same. Laying in bed though, I had trouble falling asleep. There wasn't any reason for this, it was just one of those nights. But after a while, I heard Aaron's bedroom door open. I was listening because there was nothing else to do, but no sounds came. I waited a whole 2 or 3 minutes before he started walking, slowly down the hall towards my door. Just as he was passing though, he stopped. I heard the floorboards creak, followed by the door thump softly, as if he was pressing up against it. He stayed there behind the door for a while. I don't even know how long, but then he walked away. Not back toward his room, but the other way, toward the main hallway. Then a door opened and closed. I didn't know what to think. It was really weird and creepy, but also I'd known Aaron for a while now and didn't see him as a weird person. But what was he doing? And where did he go? I stayed awake as long as I could, waiting to hear him come back, but he never did. Over the next few nights, I noticed a pattern. Every time I would go to bed, about 30 minutes later, Aaron would open his door, stand still for a minute, then walk to my door, stand still again, then leave and go into the locked door. He never slept in his room. He always slept somewhere behind the weird locked door. What made it so creepy was that he was trying so hard to keep a secret from me. I decided one night that I was going to figure this all out, because I was beginning to feel unsafe. I went to bed and waited for Aaron to do his usual routine. He opened his bedroom door and walked over to mine. Then, as soon as I heard him unlock and open the other door, I got up and quickly went into the hallway, catching him standing by the open door. He looked back at me, clearly startled. "Hey, is everything okay, Aaron?" I asked. He just stared at me, eyes still open wide from the scare I gave him. "Why do you keep going to that door every night?" I broke the silence, getting impatient. We were standing on opposite sides of the long, dark hallway, but I could sense that something was wrong with him. We stared at each other still, and I took a step closer. "Aaron?" As soon as I spoke his name, he ran around the corner and straight to the back door, opening it and continuing to run for the trees. I looked out the back door, seeing him disappear into the dark woods. I was shaking, horrified at what just happened. I have no words to describe the unknown thoughts running through my head. I closed the back door, then grabbed a knife from the kitchen and walked over to the door Aaron had opened. It was in fact a basement, but there was no light switch and it clearly had not been renovated like the rest of the house. The walls were old, decaying wood. I debated whether or not to go down. I was so intrigued and curious, but terrified as well. The longer I stood there, the more afraid I became. I turned and ran back to my room, packed everything I could and stuffed them in my car, and drove away, never looking back. I never talked to Aaron again, and he never tried to contact me either. I didn't know what was going on with him, or what he was doing in that house, but I didn't want to be involved. After a while, I forgot about it, but almost 5 years later, I found myself wondering about it again. I looked up the house online and found some strange things. It had been torn down years ago. There was an article from 5 years ago, just a few months after I left, stating that the house was abandoned. To me, this meant that when Aaron ran away that night, he never came back. I kept reading, and it stated that the house was torn down due to what they described as criminal findings. It didn't go into any more detail about what those criminal findings were. This really had me shaken up for a few weeks. Things like this probably wouldn't happen nowadays, but you can never be too careful. I'm a 25-year-old male, and this happened to me 3 years ago. I had just signed a lease for a small house in the town I lived in. Having been living in an apartment for a few years, I didn't have a lot of furniture or large house decorations to fill the space in my rental. While I had a decent-sized couch and TV stand, I only had a mini TV that I wanted to put up in my bedroom since it was so small. Not having a ton of money to work with though, I took to Craigslist to find a larger TV for the living room. I found a few nice flat-screen TVs listed on the site. They were all over my budget though, and honestly, a lot nicer than I actually needed. I just wanted a large TV to fill the space in my living room. I didn't actually care about the quality of the picture on the TV. Anyway, I finally found one that seemed to work with what I needed. It was cheap, large, and was said to be in working condition. It was an old flat-screen TV from probably 10 years ago. Compared to today, they aren't even considered flat screens anymore, as they're usually 3 to 4 inches thick and really heavy. I sent the owner an email and continued with my search. Finding nothing else worth looking into, I just hoped for the best with that one TV. It wasn't until the following morning that I received a response to my email. The owner introduced himself as Mitch and said he'd love to show me the TV whenever I was available. I don't know if I just read it in a weird way or what, but he seemed to be over the top excited about this. It made me a little uncomfortable, but I just figured it was a happy old man or something. I said I could do any day this week after I got off work at 6, and Mitch said tomorrow at 6:30 would be perfect for him, leaving his address at the bottom of the email, along with a Google Calendar invite to an event labeled as Craigslist TV. I accepted it, though I wasn't really sure what the purpose of it was, and it was definitely not a normal thing people do. but it didn't affect me in any way. I got my truck emptied out, and the next day I went to work, then went straight to his address afterwards. It was dark out by now, and when I pulled into his driveway, I saw all the lights were on inside. I checked one last time to make sure I had all the cash on hand, then got out of my truck and went to the front door. Walking up, I could see that the front door was partially open. There was no screen door or anything, just one main door. Thinking it was left open for me, I leaned over and peeked inside, but didn't see anyone, so I rang the doorbell. Right when the bell rang, I heard something drop on the far end of the house. Then it went quiet. There was something about that noise that made me start getting nervous. After a moment, I decided I had a bad feeling about this and was just going to leave. But then footsteps came from behind the door, which then opened slightly wider, revealing a man. "Need something?" he said, half his body still behind the door. Yeah, I was here to look at your TV. We scheduled for 6:30 today." The man looked at me for a second. "Alright." He opened the door completely and let me inside. I will say, at that moment, I knew something was wrong. He wasn't acting at all like he was in the emails. I expected a happy old man, not a large, grumpy, middle-aged dude, but I was already inside by the time all the alarms were going off in my head. The TV was in the room right next to the door, so he stood there while I looked at it. Yeah, this looks good. I'll take it," I said, not even knowing if it worked or not, but I wanted to get this over with quickly. I held out the money. He looked at it for a moment, then back at me. He reached out and took it, then shoved it in his pocket, and without giving me any time to react, he grabbed me by the shoulder and shoved me back towards the door, yelling at me to leave. I didn't argue. I sprinted out to my truck and drove away. Not long after, I pulled to the side and called the police to let them know I'd been robbed. The whole time, I was just thinking about how stupid they were, meeting me at their own house, robbing me, and letting me go, knowing that I knew where they lived. But when the police got to the house and called me back, I was in complete shock, hearing what they told me. Over that week, though, things became more clear. The man I met at the house was not Mitch. Mitch, the owner of the house, was found unconscious in the kitchen. Thankfully, he survived, though he had some pretty bad injuries. The man I met at the door was another customer Mitch was meeting from Craigslist to pick up some kitchenware he was also selling. He ended up beating and robbing Mitch, likely just minutes before I showed up. What's even crazier is that Mitch had sent that man a Google Calendar invite as well, and the man accepted it, probably unknowing that I showed his email, which just so happened to be his first and last name. He was caught within a few days. During this whole case, I got to actually meet Mitch, and he was indeed a happy old man, even despite what happened to him. Being a relatively young and shy person, I've started using dating apps to help me meet more people and hopefully find a lasting relationship. I struggle with putting myself out there, especially in public with people I've never met, so apps like Tinder are great for me to get comfortable talking with someone before actually meeting them in person. For reference, I'm a female in my early 20s and I've been using Tinder for a little over a year at the time. Most of my interactions up until this point had been fine, usually either ending up dating for a couple months or just becoming friends. All of the breakups had been mutual and had no hard feelings. Anyway, this began a couple months after my last relationship. I was talking to a guy who I'll refer to as Peter for about 2 weeks on Tinder. From our back and forth texting, he seemed like a nice, somewhat shy person, but part of me liked that because I was shy as well. Eventually, he finally asked me out on a date, and we met up at a local restaurant later that week. Upon meeting him in person, nothing seemed off at first. One of my biggest fears is that they'll look nothing like they did in the pictures, but Peter didn't look any different, and he was just as soft-spoken as he was over text. Our conversation at dinner that night was really awkward though. He barely spoke and kept looking around. Me, not being a big talker either, was trying really hard to get him to open up a bit, but he would give simple one-word answers. At one point, he even left the table saying he forgot something in his car and didn't come back for almost 15 minutes, leaving me there alone. So, of course, when dinner was done with, I kindly told him that I didn't feel a great connection and didn't want to continue further in a relationship with him. He stood quietly and nodded, then walked to his car. I felt bad, but that's just how it was. I got my car and headed home. That night, I thought about Peter a few times, feeling weird now that I didn't have anyone to text, but I sat down and turned on a movie to clear my mind. It was nearly 11 p.m. when I heard soft footsteps coming up to my front door and stopping. I muted the TV and turned to face the door, still sitting on the couch. I was tired, but I knew I had heard someone. 30 seconds of anticipation went by before a few loud knocks banged on the door. It startled me, even though I was half expecting it. I got up and looked through the peephole, and to my surprise at the time, Peter was standing there. I opened the door a crack and stuck my head out. What are you doing here, Peter? Peter looked at me, then turned away for a moment, looking around. This made me feel really uneasy, and I just shut the door and locked it, hoping he'd get the hint to leave my property. After a few seconds, I heard footsteps departing towards the driveway, and a car turning on and leaving. I checked the window to make sure he was gone, then sat back on the couch. I think I was just too tired to realize in the shock of the moment, but it wasn't until I sat back down that I realized that I had never given Peter my address. A really bad feeling surged through my body, and I went to check the window again to be safe. I didn't necessarily feel in danger at this point, but just worried that Peter may have something wrong with him and had grown too attached to me. I went to bed not long after and slept well through the night. In the morning, I made coffee and breakfast, and due to the cold, snowy weather, I stayed inside most of the day. It wasn't until I was bringing the trash out to the road that I noticed a set of footprints around the side of the house. Following them, they went around both sides of the house and right up to the gate to the backyard, then off to the road. I tried to rethink what happened last night, but I was sure I heard Peter only walk up to the door and not around the house. So these footprints had to have been from the middle of the night while I was sleeping. Standing in my living room now, I was getting extremely uncomfortable and nervous. I know it sounds dumb, but my social anxiety was really trying to look for every reason not to call 911. At that time though, I'm very thankful that my panic overtook my anxiety and got me to call the police. This decision is very likely what saved my life. Holding my phone after talking to a dispatcher, I stared at the ground and took deep breaths to keep my head straight. I'd never dealt with something like this, so my mind wasn't prepared to handle the stress. But as I stood there, trying to calm my head, I heard footsteps in the snow outside the living room window. I'm not sure what else to describe how I felt, other than just completely scared. The footsteps stopped outside the window, and I began to back up slowly, trying to get to the kitchen. Then came a slight scraping sound, likely a knife being wedged between the window, trying to pry it open. It was an unfortunate reaction of mine to scream from the terror of it. Immediately, the footsteps ran around to the side of the house, followed by the forceful sound of the gate breaking open. I grabbed the first knife I saw in the kitchen and sprinted upstairs. Turning the corner though, I saw a glimpse of Peter outside the glass back door, trying to force it open. I locked myself in the bathroom, crying and clutching onto the kitchen knife as I listened to the harsh banging, scraping, and beating on the back door. It sounded like a bear trying to claw and smash its way inside. This went on for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, which felt like forever, I thought of all the horrible things he planned on doing when he made his way inside, making me even more emotional. But then, a knock at the front door overcame the sound of the banging at the back door, which immediately stopped. An officer called out, and I ran straight to the front door. While Peter had run off, they were able to find him pretty quickly, and he admitted to his crimes, though he gave little reasoning for doing them. He truly just seemed crazy and unstable. It's terrifying to think how this happened from seemingly meeting up with a normal, friendly guy. This whole thing has given me terrible trust issues, and I stopped using dating apps. One of the scariest things was that the back door was almost completely destroyed, barely hanging on by the latch. Likely, if the police had shown up just minutes later, Peter would have made it inside. And who knows what he would have done if he had gotten to me. I broke things off with my ex a few years ago. He became a reckless person, unable to hold a job or any responsibilities, so it just didn't work out. Even being the person he was though, I never thought he would do something like this. The few months after the breakup were quiet and peaceful. I was enjoying my single life, just going through the days. One night though, I was driving back home from work later than usual, and as I pulled into the driveway, I saw a man wearing all black standing outside a window on the left side of my house, as if they were trying to look inside. This was obviously really creepy, and I pulled back out of the driveway and parked further down the road, calling the police. I waited for them to show up, then once they informed me that whoever it was had left, I was able to go inside. They asked if I had any idea who it could have been, but at the time I said no. Again, I never thought of my ex as that kind of person, and there was nobody else I thought it could be. The next week went by without any problems as well, though I made sure all the windows were locked every night. One morning though, I woke up to the sound of movement outside my bedroom window. It sounded like an animal moving around in a bush, though my immediate thought was of that man I'd seen peering through the windows last week. I jumped out of bed and put some clothes on. The blinds were covering the windows, so I knew nobody could see anything, but now I felt the need to see for myself if somebody was there or not. I didn't want to call the police again just because a squirrel was hanging out in the bush. So, I pulled the blinds open. Nothing. I leaned my head closer to the window so I could see down the side of the house, and still, nobody was there. I sighed, immediately feeling safer, and continued about my morning as usual, then went off to work. Getting home rather late again, I was exhausted and cooked up a small dinner, then watched a bit of TV before deciding to go to bed early. I got up and walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, but in the corner of my eye, I saw something horrifying. The window was open, just a small crack at the bottom, but I knew I'd kept it locked, so either way, someone had broken it. I walked over and looked at it from up close, then pushed it shut. The latch that was used to lock it was gone, as if it had been ripped away. I felt trapped and scared, like I wasn't even in my own home anymore. I knew I had to call the police, but I began to fear making noise as the possibility of someone being in my house became more prevalent in my mind. I was just standing there for I don't know how long, listening to the silence of the house, before the sharp, sudden sound of my phone beeping made me shiver. I pulled it out of my pocket quickly, and immediately my stomach dropped. It was a text from my ex, asking how I was doing. I stared at it, just in shock and trying to piece it together in my mind. Was this just a huge coincidence? Or was it not a coincidence at all? Was he watching me right now? Fear was taking over my body. I looked around frantically, shoving myself in a corner of the room so nobody could sneak up behind me. Then, another text came in. He said, "We need to talk." I was trying to hold in my tears as I turned my phone on silent. I started making my way slowly to the front door. As I approached, I turned the knob and tried to open it quietly, though it made a rather loud creak. Immediately, a loud thump came from behind the door to my bedroom. I threw the front door open and sprinted outside and down the road. I hid on the side of a neighbor's house and called the police. They actually made it pretty quickly, and I walked over to my driveway when they arrived. After 2 officers went in, they came out a minute later holding my ex and dragging him into their car. He was pleading, saying he just wanted to talk to me and that he knew what he was doing was wrong, but he wasn't going to do anything other than talk to me. Unsurprisingly though, he had a knife shoved in his pocket. That was hopefully the last time I'll ever see or hear from him again. Obviously, I don't believe that he just wanted to talk, but that was the story he stuck with, so I'll never know what he was actually trying to do. But him waiting in my bedroom like that with a knife, I know I was lucky to get out as safely as I did.
This happened several years ago. I was home alone one evening when I heard a knock at the back door. This confused me, as no one ever used that door. My husband and I lived in a fourplex at the time, and all of the units had a back door at the top of a narrow staircase. These doors were a little inconvenient to access, as you have to go around the building and up the narrow stairs, as opposed to the wider main entrance at the front. It didn't make sense to use the back entrance, and I couldn't think of anyone who would go to that door to visit. As I approached the back door, I saw 2 tall men in the window, standing at the door. A chill went down my spine. I did not feel safe opening the door, so I called out, "Hello?" One of the men tapped on the window.
"Yes, hello. May we come in? We are with Bresnan."
At the time, my husband and I had Bresnan for cable, but did not have any issues with it. I replied, "We're not having any issues with Bresnan. Is there a problem?"
"Ma'am,"
the man said.
"can we come in? We're servicing the area, and it's important we look at your cable."
I shook my head. "We're not having any issues," I repeated, "so there's no need to stop by."
"Ma'am, we are visiting every resident. Let us in so we can do our job."
I noticed the man grab the doorknob and try to open the locked door. I slowly grabbed a knife from our knife's block and held it at my chest. "We're not having any issues," I repeated, trying not to convey shakiness of my voice. "So you don't need to be here." The 2 figures appeared to shuffle and then straighten.
"Let us in. We're on a deadline and need to do our job."
I glanced at the clock, gauging when my husband would arrive home from work. I gripped the knife tighter.
"Ma'am, ma'am."
I saw him try the doorknob again. I closed my eyes and felt overwhelming gratitude of always locking my doors. Just then, a thought came to the forefront of my mind. "I'm sorry, I can't help you. Could I please get your names and badge numbers? I can give your supervisor a call to let them know that our cable is fine." I heard another shuffle, and one of the men replied,
"No need to, ma'am. We're sorry we wasted your time."
With that, both of the men exited the staircase and disappeared into the night. Shaken up, I held the knife tight and tried to get my bearings. I remember making a mental note to call the cable company or the police, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold my phone. With the knife still grasped to my chest and the phone falling out of my other hand, I sank to the floor and cried. When my husband returned home, I told him what had happened. I was still very shaken up and had started crying again after he came home. He immediately called the Bresnan Cable Company and spoke to a representative who informed us that no one from their company was out on assignment in our area. The next day, we asked our neighbors if they had had a visit from the company. no one had. So, to the creepy men who tried to break into my home under the disguise of cable repair, let's not meet. This happened to me around Christmas of 2015. I detailed what happened on my private social media accounts, and several women have messaged me and told me that they went through nearly identical situations at the same bookstore. I was pursuing a bookstore in my city around Christmas time. I was alert and often looking out for men following me. But this particular time, I was curious to see that just around every corner, whether I was browsing in nonfiction or fiction, a pair of older women were behind me or brushing by me to get to a shelf that I had just been looking at. The first woman was probably in her 70s, with a very exaggerated limp and making grunting noises with every movement. The second woman was possibly in her 60s and talking extremely loud to her partner about, "Ooh, check out this book. Look at the cover. It's so beautiful, interesting, weird." It became clear to me right away that they were turning up in every aisle I was in, not even seconds after I'd pick up a book. What ended up giving me the creeps was that I made it to the last aisle of comics. I had no interest or intent to look, but I was testing to see if I was followed. Sure fucking enough, these women trailed behind me and started grabbing books. "Oh wow, look at how cool these little books are." I made eye contact with one of them and decided to bolt. One of the women, the younger of the two, was smiling widely at me, almost as if she recognized me. I leave the bookstore and paused at the front in order to let a car pass by, and then I hear an, "Excuse me, ma'am." I turn to see the woman walking up to me. One is still limping and now holding her shoulder as if she's in some kind of pain. The younger woman immediately begins saying in a very rushed, impatient voice, "Can you please help us? We have forgotten where we parked. I think it was somewhere towards the back. Can you please give us a ride around here until we see the car? Please, we're just a couple of old, fat ladies. We can't walk like we used to be able to." The last part threw me off. Who even says something like that unless it's some kind of weird guilt trip? Every alarm bell was going off in my head, and I just knew the limp was fake and their whole energy was shady. I was panicking, and I felt primal even. For the first time in my life, I yelled, "Fuck you," to a complete stranger. I ran back into the store, told a cashier who was a bigger, muscular guy who went out to check the situation, possibly to see if the woman did really need help. Saw them wave down a car driven by a younger-looking guy, as if they were waiting on him the whole time. They got in the car and left. Like I said earlier, there have been several more reports over the years of these women doing this at the same store. Always a pair of weird older women claiming that they need help to get to their car. Once they're refused or ignored, they get picked up anyway, I've heard. Now the bookstore has heightened security, but it gives me the creeps even to this day. I haven't heard anything about them in a while. I wonder what's happened, or if they've moved to a different spot. So, just as some background, I am a male and currently 25 and still living within 15 miles of my old house. This happened when I was around 8 or 9, making my sister at the time 5 or 6. We lived in a quiet neighborhood that, once I grew up, I found was actually a lower income part of town. However, we had some wonderful neighbors, and it was thanks to these neighbors that a lot of potentially negative situations were avoided. At the time, my dad was working an 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. job, and my mother was a secretary at a hospital, which meant that during the day, she was often at work. Usually my sister and I had a babysitter, but once I reached about 8 or 9, I began to be old enough to look out for us without a babysitter. Now, mind you, this was the 90s, which certainly were not safe, but were much safer than they are now. Also, we had the previously mentioned neighbors who generally did a good job of keeping an eye on us and our house. This particular incident was one of the first times I was charged to babysit my sister. She was in her high chair eating whatever my mom had left for us when I got a knock on our front door. Now, this was strange since we never got visitors on a regular basis, other than the boy across the street who would want us to come out and play, but he usually just yelled my name while knocking. I was young and naive and decided to open the door. There was a locked screen door beyond that. I left that closed and locked. Outside was a middle-aged man. I hardly remember his facial features or even body type. I remember his yellow shirt and dirty jeans. "Can I help you?" I asked innocently. No alarm bells going off yet.
Hey there, are your parents home?
All right, first alarm bell. My parents teaching me not to trust strangers rushed through my head, but I still didn't quite fully grasp the potential danger here. My mom went to the store. She'll be back any minute. Weird half-lie. I could have said that she was here, but in the shower, or that she was lying down upstairs. I'm glad that I didn't tell him that she wouldn't be back for quite a few hours, but looking back, it's scary how naive I was.
Well, that's no problem. Hey, so look, my dog went missing, and I think it went into your backyard. Do you mind if I come in and we can go check it out?
Okay, so I may have been dumb, but I wasn't that dumb. There was no way in hell I was letting this stranger into my house, especially with my sister there. She was my first thought. Sure, I didn't want to have any harm fall on me, but she was my sister, and it was my job to keep her safe. I should have closed the door right then and there, but once again, I went with a less safe, but still not totally stupid route. Well, the gate should be unlocked. If you want to go check in the backyard, you can, and promptly closed the door. Now, of course, I was very curious if there was a stray dog in my backyard. Dogs are great. Even with the weird guy being around, I was pretty interested to see how his search in the backyard went. So I decided to check the back window and see if there was actually a dog, and if so, if the man would catch it. Now, at this point, I'm sure that you figured out that there was no dog, and when I looked out the back window, I could see almost the entire yard, including the gate. The man wasn't there. This was mere seconds after I had closed the door on him. I waited for a few minutes, but he never showed up. After about 5 minutes, there was another knock on my door. This time I was much more wary, and I didn't like this guy showing up. I was pretty tired of the whole ordeal, but I still hadn't fully grasped the situation. I kept the chain lock on the door and cracked it open. "Did you find your dog?" Again, I can't remember his facial features, so I really cannot recall his expression, but I remember his tone was a bit desperate, as well as annoyed.
No, I looked all over the yard, and I couldn't find him. I have a picture in my car if you want to take it, just in case you see him.
Nope, no more. I still didn't understand abduction, but I certainly wasn't going to go anywhere outside of the house with this stranger. I told him that he can leave a picture in the mailbox and we will keep an eye out, once again promptly closing the door. What followed is really what creeps me out to this day. Looking back, I was freaked out that I had come that close to exposing my sister and myself to danger, but this scared the shit out of me. Suddenly, there was more knocking on my door. Not the screen door separating the door itself. Like I mentioned previously, the screen door was locked, and unless that was open, it was impossible to knock on the door itself. It freaked me the fuck out, and I took my sister to my bedroom and crept back out to the kitchen, where I could see out into the front yard, and I saw the man quickly getting back into his car, while my saint of a next-door neighbor, Joan, stood on her front lawn, smoking and watching him intently. It took a long time for me to add it all up, and honestly, I had forgotten about it for a long time. When I finally remembered it all, I couldn't even believe my own memories. I'm still debating with myself to actually tell my parents now. I wouldn't want to unnecessarily upset them, but maybe it's an important story to tell my 2 younger sisters, one of whom is getting married soon. Just as a life lesson. Mr. Yellow Shirt Man? Yeah, let's not meet ever again.
I worked at a small local diner for a year back in 2019. It was just a regular ordinary restaurant, and I was a server there. The place closed at 10 every night, but my shift actually ended at 11 because I had to clean all the tables in the back room before heading home. It was a normal night of closing alone, and I just locked the doors at 10 p.m. I began wiping down the tables, but after just a couple seconds, several loud knocks came from the front door. It made me jump, but I looked over and saw a man standing there, looking through the glass door. I spoke loudly, telling him the place was closed for the night. This has happened before, so it wasn't much of a big deal, but the guy stayed there for a little bit as if he didn't understand what I said. I walked closer to the door. "Sorry, the store closed at 10. We aren't taking any more orders tonight." I spoke even louder this time, so I knew he heard me. The guy looked at me for a second with no reaction, before making a slight smile and turning around as he walked away. I thought he might have been drunk or something, but I forgot about it after a couple minutes and continued with my work. I finished cleaning all the tables and started wiping down the front counter when I saw out of the corner of my eye a figure moving towards the front door, followed by knocking again. It was the same guy from 15 minutes ago, standing right outside, looking through the door at me. I'd never had someone do this before, so I was more annoyed this time. I raised both of my arms up as in a "what are you doing" kind of gesture. The man, still staring at me, knocked again. I told him with a very loud and strict voice that we were closed and he needed to leave. This time though, he looked very bothered by what I had said. He tensed up, then gave the door a small push as if to test if it was locked or not, before walking away. "What the hell is wrong with that guy?" I said out loud to myself as I walked towards the front windows to make sure that he was leaving the area. I didn't see him anywhere in the parking lot, so I figured he was gone for good. I checked the time and was slightly annoyed as it was later than I was hoping, but just as I began walking over to the counter, a sudden loud bang came from the restaurant's back door. I froze in fear as I wasn't confident whether or not the back door was locked. But a couple seconds later, they began hitting the door over and over. Knowing now that the door was locked, I knew I needed to leave while I still had the chance. I sprinted out the front door and got my car, calling the police as fast as I could. After a minute or two, I could see through the restaurant window as the man appeared and began looking through the whole building. Then he tried to open the cash register, but I think he gave up after a few tries, and then he disappeared to the back of the store. Once the police arrived, they made sure the man was gone and then got the whole story from me. The back door had huge dents in it, and the door handle was almost completely gone, clearly having been beaten by a hammer or something. But other than that, there wasn't much damage, or even anything stolen aside from the tip jar that we kept at the front counter. I just find it crazy that some people are willing to do these sort of things just for a couple extra bucks. Who knows what he would have done if I had stood in his way.
Our official merch store is finally here. If you want to support more of our channel, check out our merch shop. The link is in the description down below. See you on the next video.